You
Got it.
all, most of you, maybe all of you saw the email that I asked Jim to send about the mistake I made last week. What I'd like to do is go back and fix that mistake. You may, if you read the email, you know, I'll go through this quickly, but in case you didn't read the email, I do want to correct a mistake I made last week. And it's one of those things where I just in my mind sort of associated numbers that sounded the same or were close, but aren't the same. And so I want to fix that because it's a significant mistake. And so a little bit of repeat, and then I thought, you know, as I thought more about the lesson we're going through, I thought maybe I should add in some historical background type information to help us think more in this case about how the New Testament came together. And then next week we'll move on to angels and demons. And so next week we'll focus on angels. I won't be live unless I'm not able to go. I'm supposed to be on a meeting in just outside of Washington, D.C. next weekend, unless this COVID thing continues to affect us. Sue, you may not have heard, but Joni has COVID and is at the tail end of it. So we're quarantining right now. And if perchance I get it or something else happens, I may not be going, in which case I'll come live. So either live or via video recording next week on angels. It's a fascinating topic, angels and demons. So we'll see how that goes. All right. This week, let me go back to where I was for a moment last week. And you'll see that I've changed a few terms to be more precise in my language, and that will help us make the right kind of distinctions. And please do ask questions for all this to become as clear as possible. So the oldest extant Bible, the whole Bible, here's where the date was wrong. I said 325 BCE, and that was wrong. It's 325 CE because it is the whole Bible. Codex Vaticanus, which I mentioned, the Old Testament in that version, that codex, is the Septuagint. So the Codex Vaticanus is all in Greek, and the Old Testament is the Greek version of the Old Testament, known as the Septuagint. Now, here's where I got a little confused, or sort of ran some things together. The oldest Hebrew Old Testament manuscript, so not the whole Bible, it's a manuscript fragment, which is a section of Exodus to Leviticus, comes from the 3rd century BCE. This is where you see it's the 4th century CE, but 3rd century. So 325 and 3rd, I just ran things together in my talk last week. So I'm correcting that now. So the oldest Hebrew section of the Old Testament is a manuscript fragment. It's a significant chunk, but it comes from Exodus through Leviticus, 3rd century BCE. So that's actually before the Septuagint. Septuagint, Greek version. So this section that they found among the Dead Sea Scrolls goes back before the Greek version of the Old Testament into the 3rd century before Christ. Now, I didn't share this at all last week, but this is really interesting because it gets at how scholars figure out how to date various parts of the Bible. And this next find, which is a relatively recent find, I call it the oldest Old Testament text because it's actually only 3 verses from the book of Numbers. And as I said in the email, if you grew up in the Methodist Church and you went to Methodist Youth Fellowship, you probably had the practice of ending MYF with this blessing: the Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face to shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. I was in MYF all through high school, and junior high too, and we ended every MYF meeting with that blessing. Well, that's the Aaron's blessing from the book of Numbers. You see the reference there. This scroll was found in a ruins in Jerusalem, in or near the valley of Hinnom, Ketef Hinnom, and it's a scroll made of silver. It's a little tiny scroll, and the scholars think it might have served like almost like what we think of as an amulet, you know, a little possession that with that blessing was considered good luck in a way. Now that scroll dates from the 7th century BCE. So now we're back before the Babylonian exile. This discovery extends the writing of the Old Testament further back into the history of Israel than scholars for a generation or two have thought. Most scholars have thought that the Old Testament really began to take shape in the form that we eventually know it, starting with the Babylonian captivity and later. Well, the Babylonian captivity starts in 586 or 7 BCE. And so the formation of the Old Testament that we have in our Bibles is really associated with those dates, exile and later. But this is an example of texts being around before the exile. So very much like any sort of detective work that police or detectives have to do, what scholars do is they get this little bit of evidence and they piece it together with other evidence, and a picture begins to form. I think the one thing we should always keep in mind when we read commentaries and information related to these kinds of topics, scholars, the best scholars, always speak or write with a certain degree of tentativeness about these dates, because almost invariably there's no lockdown definitive conclusion that can be made. They can be pretty confident about many things related to these subjects, but as you can see, the evidence is fairly spotty in some ways. Now, by comparison to other documents and stories and whatnot outside the Bible is actually quite well attested to by comparison. There are lots of copies available for scholars to study, but still, we cannot get right in the time that the Bible is telling us about. So the Exodus, for example, most scholars date the Exodus to the 13th century. We don't have any documents that talk about the Exodus that are from the 13th century. So, but piecing together what we do have, scholars have ways of estimating when these events happen. So again, we have to keep in mind, there are the events as they are told in the Bible, and then there is the formation of the Bible itself, which trails along after the events, which that's just be expected, right? The one difference I think scholars are beginning to grapple with more systematically is that the Jews, the Hebrews, had writing available to them during the time of the Exodus actually is now fairly widely accepted, I would say. So we have oral tradition, but we likely also have, as they're putting the Bible together, there were sources that are written down that could have come, and I emphasize could have come from the time of the events themselves. So I'm trying to be very careful here and not say it did happen that way, but it certainly could have been that way. I think now we feel like we have a little bit more confidence that the events as they happened might have had some written sources closer to the time. So the gap for the oral tradition is smaller than scholars used to think it was. Now, does this clear up the time frame? What I said last week was wrong. It's actually CE or AD for the Codex Vaticanus, but there are older manuscripts that go back into BCE, before Christ, etc. That's the point here. Let me just quickly remind us of the time frame for the composition of the Old Testament. I mentioned this last week, and I won't belabor these points, but you can see them there. The New Testament is written in the first century, so in that sense closer to the events themselves than the Old Testament, but still after the fact. I think I mentioned this last week, so I won't belabor these points either, except to note this last one, that ancient Hebrew, there's evidence for this early version of Hebrew going back to the 12th century, and that does get us within range of the events that are being described in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Now, I also mentioned this, and I'll come back to this point with the New Testament, but I did want to give you a couple of one example from a literary document. But in these archaeological digs, for 100+ years now, they've been discovering various forms of evidence, sources, government archives, administrative records. I think I mentioned this last week, but and I don't remember where this is, but in which of these digs it was found, but a marriage contract.
Oh, wow.
Right, so this is beautiful. I don't remember the material. I think it was probably, it might have been papyrus, it could have been a clay tablet, but a marriage contract that, gives us a little feeling of the flavor of what's, happening on the ground in local areas. So if you're interested in this sort of thing, you could Google biblical archaeology and get all kinds of stuff. You could find all kinds of stuff, but it's amazing what they have discovered, and little bit here and there, they keep discovering more that fills in the background. Now, the types of discoveries that I've mentioned, I didn't say rituals and liturgies. So these temples that have been excavated, they have found rituals, liturgies used in this. So again, all these things help to fill in the sort of cultural background for what we see in the Old and New Testaments. These bullet points relate primarily now to the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we have written sources like Josephus, whom I'll mention in a little bit, that help us with some of the history of the New Testament. Now, I want to mention 2 sources that perhaps you've heard of. The Mesopotamian Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi was one of the kings in Babylon. The Code of Hammurabi is dated to the 18th century BCE, so this is the 1700s. And there is rough similarity between some of the laws in this code and the Old Testament laws. So this makes scholars really interested in this kind of work. What does that mean? It suggests that in the earliest days, these Canaanite peoples, these Mesopotamian and Canaanite peoples, are interacting with each other in a variety of ways, politically, commercially. They're sharing stories, they're sharing ideas, and that phenomenon of sharing we see in the Old Testament itself. Now, here's where there's a little tweak in the scholarship. It's a significant tweak, but I don't want to make more of it than I should. For a long time, scholars just said the Jews borrowed these stories from these other peoples. It was kind of a one-way street. Now scholars are modifying that to say sharing, because you can't really determine that this one thing came before this other thing. And so it is as possible that stories from among the Hebrews were shared and these other cultures are picking up. So more of a two-way street. This is one of those cases where I speak very cautiously. I'm not trying to draw any hard and fast conclusions, except to tell you now, scholars are talking more about sharing than borrowing. One really interesting story is the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh. It's long, and there's more going on in the story than just the flood story. This is classic ancient Near Eastern mythology, but there are some similarities in the story of in Gilgamesh to the flood story that we find in Genesis. This is an example of where I would say now scholars are probably describing this more in terms of there's a common stock of stories that ancient Near Eastern cultures kind of shared. And so the writer, the editor, the compiler of Genesis is drawing on this sort of material. So let me show you just a couple of sections, small sections from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which again, you can go online. If you want to read the Epic of Gilgamesh, you can read it. It's not, there are gaps in the story. So, but you can read it. You can look at this yourself. All right, here we go. Ea the prince was under oath with them. So he repeated their talk to the reed house. Reed house, wall, wall, so on. Tear down the house and build a boat. Abandon wealth and seek living beings. Spurn possessions and keep alive living beings. So you can see this reference to build a boat. That's the similarity. There's a lot of difference too. It's not exactly the same story. And then further down, the child carried the pitch. The weak brought whatever else was needed. On the fifth day, I had laid out her exterior, the boat. It was a field in area. So it's a big boat. Its walls were each 10 times 12 cubits in height. See the similarity to the Genesis story. The sides of its top were of equal length, 10 times 12 cubits each. These are just a couple of very brief examples of similarities that the flood story in Genesis and the Epic of Gilgamesh share. If you read the story, the outcome of the story, the purpose of the story has a lot of difference from the Genesis story, but still these similarities. So scholars conclude that in these ancient times, these various peoples familiar with each other shared these stories. There was a kind of common sense about origins that shows up in this Epic of Gilgamesh.
Hey, Steve.
Yeah.
I have a question. So do they, I guess you could probably read the whole gamut of ideas, but do people say that it's likely that a massive flood did happen? And this is the meaning of it that different peoples had? Or do they say there probably was never really such a thing? They're just stories.
Yeah. Well, it's actually probably bits of both of what you said. On the one hand, there is evidence, and this would be geological evidence, and I can't, this is something that I've read about, but I'm not going to be able to call to mind right now the details of what I read, but there is geologic evidence for a widespread flood in that area of the world. So from one sense, if you're in the middle of something like that, it could feel like what we think of as a worldwide flood. The way Genesis describes the flood, most scholars conclude there never was a worldwide flood like how it's described in Genesis. But again, Genesis isn't trying to give us a newspaper account of what happened. I think it's quite legitimate to say the writer of Genesis is simply employing legendary type material. But legend, keep in mind, is often, I'll say it that way, rooted in historical events. So when I use the word legend, I'm not saying everything is made up. So back to your question, Joni, that there was some kind of widespread deluge and flood. Scholars are now saying that's actually possible, and we see some evidence for it in the geologic record. That it was a worldwide flood, that goes beyond what the evidence shows. Yeah, Jody.
And the author or authors of Genesis didn't know he was writing the Bible. You know, he was telling some stories, or am I wrong?
Well, that's a great question. It's a great question. So again, I think we can say yes and no. Did the writer of Genesis have a vision of a collection of books that would become the canon, the authority for all these different peoples? Very unlikely. We can always remember that if God is overseeing the production of this book we now have, that the writer may have had more of a sense than we can tell just from the writing. On the other hand, Jody, I think it is likely that the writer knows he's putting something together that's very, very important for the identity and mission of this group of people. Right. And so it should carry authority that we eventually formalize in using a word like canon. Good question.
Hey, Steve.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to, okay, that whatever the author or authors of the Old Testament, that they wrote it down and that other people preserved it the way it has been preserved. Wouldn't that indicate that people did know it was more than just a Jane Austen novel?
Oh, absolutely. That was my point just a second ago.
Uh-huh.
I think in the mind of the writers and the editors, they have the very strong sense that we have to capture this story. We have to gather these things, because this tells us about who we are in our relationship with God. These documents are indispensable for our understanding who we are and then who God is. Well, this is where we keep in mind that the Bible assumes, the Bible doesn't set out to prove the existence of Yahweh, the Lord God of Israel. The Bible assumes Yahweh is the God who created the heavens and the earth. Yeah.
Well, and I was just thinking the very next generation had to recognize the same thing that the people who wrote it down were thinking. I mean, it's had to have been recognized somehow like that from day one. Otherwise, why would we have?
Sure. Yeah, that's right.
To it and passed it down.
Yeah. These are essential stories to who we are. Bill? Yeah. I think I heard Bill and then Jody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Steve, my question, or actually a request, may be better inserted somewhere else in your outline. But I'm fascinated with the whole continuum from, for example, in the Old Testament, the administration documents, the traditions, and so on. From there to a compilation of texts into the codex. From there, the sprinkling of holy water on it to become the Holy Bible, and now it's accepted by Christians. So
Mhm.
I'm thinking that of the cliche leap of faith, that
Mhm.
there's a great leap of faith in this thing, and it kind of ties in with your discussion of faith.
Yeah. Oh, that's again, just a fascinating thought. I'll try to respond. This is one of those thoughts that I have to kind of think out loud, and then I can ramble all over the place. So I'm trying to gather myself here.
I was
And
thinking,
my thing kind of goes with Bill.
Okay.
Because I'm thinking like Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Maybe it started there and it was that, and they wrote that down because that was real important on how they live their daily lives. And then someone says, oh, and then we have this text, and maybe it wasn't called Genesis, that has these compilation of stories. Maybe we should put those together, so it kind of goes along with Bill's and what
Yeah.
how did it become this Bible?
well, Steve, I'm thinking that might be something that would be an add-on to your discussion of the formation of the Bible after you've had a chance to think it through and organize your thoughts. Because I'm sure it's a subject that about which textbooks are written.
Yes.
Yeah.
I can say two things clearly right now, and I will give some more thought to this. The first thing I want to say is when we generally use the word faith, we tend to think of that word as an action we take in the absence of knowledge, which shows the formation we've had in the West since the time of the Enlightenment. There were skeptics long before the Enlightenment, but nonetheless, we have been shaped very much by an understanding of faith as something we do in the absence of knowledge because we don't know. This is a mistake. It's a mistake for us. It's an innocent mistake because we all learned it this way. We learned it very subtly. But it is a mistake to separate faith and knowledge the way our Western culture does. So I think we have to practice recognizing the unnecessary limitations. Actually, I would say the false limitations of that understanding of faith. Now, the other thing I want to say, and then we can move on. We can, this topic will come up again, I'm sure. But what we know that we don't have formal, official decisions that identify the Old Testament as the Old Testament. We don't have the same kind of decisions that identify the New Testament. And now some body of leaders someplace says, we now officially recognize XYZ as the Bible. That happens later, a lot later. But what we see in the history of the formation of the Bible is that people on the ground, as it were, recognize the power and the usefulness of these documents. And it's happening as the documents are written and then shared. So we get little glimpses in the New Testament, late in the New Testament period of in 2 Peter, there's a reference to Paul's writings, and the language used there, Paul's writings are considered scripture. Now, the word scripture is just a word that means writings, but it starts to take on the connotation of this writing has particular significance and authority and power. We're gonna regard this writing as guiding us in ways that other writings don't. There's no formal official decision that says what I just said until much, 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 much later. And so it's interesting to think that there is a kind of unity coalescing among believers around these documents as the documents that really show us about God and the gospel. It's a little bit maddening because we don't have, we can't pinpoint the moment, right? But historians will tell you that there's widespread agreement that these documents are the documents that we see as our authority, even though there's no official decision. It's amazing.
Stephen, I would also suggest that we don't have their source materials, but there were the academicians, I guess I'll call them, who were theologians at the time in the 2nd century. I mean, the Origen and Tertullius and oh, I don't know, I probably forced to think of one
Irenaeus.
other, but Irenaeus, yeah. I mean, they're in the dealing with what later became scripture in the in 325, I guess. So, and they're dealing with this in the latter half of the 2nd century. So, there's a lot of reason to believe that there's a lot of authenticity in the Codex Vaticanus,
right.
what we now have as a Bible.
I think, I think this point I'm about to share is completely uncontroversial. It's what I said earlier. The Bible and the documents in the Bible are vastly more attested with manuscript evidence than many other ancient stories. And the Bible has been heavily scrutinized, again, because of our Western kind of skeptical approach to knowledge. It's been heavily scrutinized, which is actually good for us. We can be glad for that scrutiny. And it's one of the reasons I think we can say the Bible stands the test of time. But it's always going to be an open question. There's always going to be scholarly debate.
Hey, Steve.
Yeah.
So maybe this isn't the right time for this question, but I thought of it earlier, and what Richard said made me think of it again. So lately, I hear a lot of people remind us that the writers of the New Testament were reading the Septuagint. And you said earlier that the Codex Vaticanus is the whole Bible, and the version of the Old Testament is the Septuagint.
Right.
So when did we stop using the Septuagint as our Old Testament? Was it as soon as it started going into English? Then, because I feel like it's confusing.
Well, wasn't Latin used in there by the Roman Catholic Church? And
it is confusing, Joni. It's confusing because the Old Testament that we have in our Bibles now, in modern English versions, relies on what's called the Masoretic text, Hebrew. This story is very complicated, and I only know the broadest outlines of it because I'm not a Bible scholar in that sense. The Masoretic texts are not as old as the Septuagint, but they can be shown to go back to Hebrew that is older than the Septuagint. So when we read our Old Testament, we're getting, as we've noticed, if the New Testament quotes an Old Testament passage and we go back and look at that Old Testament passage, the words don't match that well sometimes. And that's because the New Testament writers are quoting from the Septuagint, the Greek. So we get that. There's a kind of a chafing there or a rubbing there. But the Masoretic text, again, the scholars, these scribes, these Masoretes, who are hundreds of years into the Common Era or into the Christian era, were able to go back and sort of recreate these ties to an older Hebrew version or versions of the Old Testament.
Were they Jewish scholars or
Yes.
is it a Christian thing?
No. The Masoretes were all Jews.
Okay.
Yeah. They're Jewish scribes.
Okay.
So I wish I could say more about that to fill in some of the blanks, but I'm afraid start making mistakes again. So
Okay.
let's press on here. Again,
That's
just
a
to
Jewish document too. I was,
Yeah.
forgive me for looking at this, but it was the Encyclopedia Britannica
Mhm.
says that it was begun in the 6th century AD by Talmudic academies in Babylonia and Palestine, and was completed in the 10th century. So we're relying upon for our Old Testament then on Jewish scholarship.
Correct.
You said.
Yeah. Good. Thank you. Okay, to review this quickly, and then we'll move on to some of the New Testament stuff. What did they find in these sources? When archaeologists dig up these places, what do they find? They have found clay tablets. They have found potsherds. Potsherds are people would write on anything they could write on. So you take for example, a clay pot that gets broken. Well, you can still use portions of that clay pot and scratch writing into the clay pot. So that's what potsherds are, generally speaking, just to give you an idea. They have found wax practice pads. So in a school of boys who are learning to be scribes, this people digging in these ruins have found wax with indentations, the cuneiform indentations. So they know that they had a way of practicing writing. The clay is wet when you press in it, and then it hardens, and then you can't really use it unless you scrape it. So wax could have been heated and reheated and all that. Also on stone monuments, let me move forward to I'm sure I've shared this with you before. Merneptah was an Egyptian king, a pharaoh. His stela, so all this writing on here tells the story of King Merneptah's great achievements. And down here in this little highlighted place, these are pictographic kind of writings. Down there, it makes reference to Israel as a people. I use the word kingdom here. I probably shouldn't have used that, but it does. So 1210, you can see this is into the time of the Joshua Judges period, the settlement of the land of Canaan by Israel. So some kind of people known as Israel was in the land of Canaan about the time that it fits with the rest of the timeline that scholars have put together for the history of Israel. And the stories we find in Joshua and Judges, generally speaking, line up with, they match, generally speaking, what sources outside the Bible help us know about what's going on. So that's an example of a monument for piecing together more of the information. Now, who could read and write? Only the specially trained people could read and write. The vast majority of people were illiterate. They didn't need to read and write. So who are those people? Scribes, obviously. Government officials who are scribes, priests who were responsible for maintaining the myths and the ritual practices of a people. They could read and most of the time or often write. And then likely other people in trade. If I'm really involved in kind of a high level trade, I'm trading with other nations and I'm a successful commercial person, probably at least to some degree, I am able to read and maybe even to write because I'm entering into contractual agreements with people. And those contracts are many, many, many times written down. So,
Steve?
yeah, yeah.
So then, like the average person who sold a plot of land, for instance, would that person, like, would we assume that there's a written contract and that the scribes are writing it down? They go to a scribe?
Wait, hey, Steve, can I just interject here? Because
Sure.
this is kind of fun. When you're in law school and within the first week of your property class, this is an answer to Joni's question. You learn about the ceremonies in the Middle Ages in England for livery of seisin. Livery of seisin was where one person deeded title to land to another. And what they tended to do, and I'm relying on memory, I haven't read anything, but what they would do is they would hold a ceremony so people would remember it. And then they would take a child of the time who was old enough to remember, and they would box his ears like crazy.
Beat the daylights out of it.
Yeah, so they would make sure that he would remember it. So they weren't literate, at least the churls, people like me, and they had certain ceremonies in order to memorialize the deeding of property.
So Richard, that was in lieu of something written, like
Yeah,
a written
nothing written.
contract.
Nothing,
Nothing
yes.
written. Just beat the daylights out of the youngest person who can still remember, and that way it'll live longer than if you did it with somebody who's old.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure there were similar practices in the period of time that we're discussing, but we also, to go back to my reference to that marriage contract, there is evidence for written contracts. The average person could not read them, so they're depending on scribes, which in this case we can imagine a scribe being like a lawyer, like an attorney who has the professional skill to capture this information and to solidify it in that sense. And so we have evidence of that sort of activity going on, but I would not say that the average person has access to that kind of stuff. They had other ways of confirming an agreement. All right. Now, I want to do some hints within Scripture for how we can imagine the Bible coming into the form that we currently have it. So if you look at 1 Kings 22:39, and this shows up often in the books of Kings, you see this reference to the book of the annals of the kings of Israel. Just like the other nations surrounding them, the Hebrew peoples are recording the official acts of the kings. This becomes part of the documentary evidence that goes into the writing of what we call the Old Testament. In Jeremiah, these are just disparate examples. I'm just trying to give you an impression. There are lots of these in the Bible. Jeremiah in 21 makes reference to King Nebuchadnezzar as making war against us. Well, scholars can identify pretty well the time frame for this King Nebuchadnezzar. So you go outside the Bible, there's lots of evidence for this King Nebuchadnezzar, and here inside the Bible, Jeremiah makes reference to King Nebuchadnezzar, so we can locate Jeremiah's prophecies logically within that general time frame. Now, this is where it gets complicated, because scholars will sometimes say, well, that verse is a later addition to the original text. I don't think anybody thinks that about Jeremiah, but you can get into that sort of complication with reconstructing the history. But that's another way the Bible gives us hints with these references to historical events or people that then we can figure out the book of Jeremiah in its original beginning points comes from that period of time. We know about Baruch in the Bible, who is Jeremiah's scribe. So Jeremiah's prophecies are being, to some degree, captured, written down, more or less as he's giving them. Jumping to the New Testament. These historical references, again, to people outside the Bible itself, so to speak. We have, here we have a reference to eyewitnesses. So Luke is trying to capture eyewitness information, but then he does also this, and this is the point that I was trying to get to. There's a reference to Caesar Augustus. Okay, we know when Augustus was the emperor. We know that time frame. Quirinius is the governor of Syria. Syria is a Roman designation for the area that we call Palestine, right? So the use of the word Syria as a designation is also a clue. So we have these people, but we also have these political or governmental references that historians of the Bible times can use to corroborate, okay, now we can locate the story that Luke is telling during a particular time. Now, the book of Luke is written later than the story being told, but still the story can be located chronologically to a fairly specific degree in the book of Luke and Acts. We get from Matthew 2 that Herod is king. Well, this is Herod the Great. So again, that we can pretty much date the birth of Jesus and the early childhood of Jesus based on these historical references. When Jesus stands before Pontius Pilate, we know Pilate's dates when he's governor. And there's reference to Annas and Caiaphas. Again, we can go outside the New Testament and find references in Jewish materials to the high priesthoods of Annas and Caiaphas. These high priests, these priests were all related to each other, right? The priesthood is hereditary. It gets passed on generation to generation. And these priests had become very affluent, elite people in the nation of Israel. Now it gets tricky. Herod in Mark 6, King Herod heard of it. Okay, he's talking about Jesus. And this is, if you read that section, John the Baptist is about to be beheaded in the story. And when Herod hears of Jesus' wondrous deeds, he thinks John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, which would be rather unsettling if you're the guy who cut off his head. But this is not Herod the Great. This is Herod Antipas. There are several Herods in the story, and they're different Herods. Antipas is a son of Herod the Great, and we know his dates. Herod Antipas is very much, as Herod the Great was, locked in with the Roman government. So we can read in Roman documentations about Herod Antipas, and we know the dates. Now we have Herod Agrippa I. Herod Agrippa I, the first, shows up in Acts chapter 12, this unusual story about Herod the king not resisting the acclaim given to him as if he were a god, and he dies of the onset of some really terrible disease. Okay, so that's in the New Testament in the book of Acts, but Josephus in the Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus is a Jewish historian, basically writing for the Roman government in a kind of pro-Roman way. But anyway, in the Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus mentions this same story that we find in Acts chapter 12. Also in Acts, we read about a time when Claudius, the emperor, kicks all the Jews out of Rome. And that again is recorded in, shall we call them, secular documents. 2 or 3 different historians of that period, Roman historians, make reference to this decision by Claudius. there's an interesting, so there are uprisings among the Jews. I don't know if you can remember, this goes way back to early in Galatians, our study of Galatians, but I made reference, I think, I may be mixing things up here, but there are all these various claimants to the title Messiah. And so Claudius, some of this turmoil has made its way to Rome, and Claudius just expels all the Jews from Rome. He's going to take care of it by getting rid of them. And so they scatter around. And here we have Aquila and Paul meeting because Claudius kicked Aquila and Priscilla out of Rome. Well, that we know that period of time is roughly the 40s CE. So we can date it. Carrying on, Felix in Acts 23 is the governor of the area. He's in Caesarea. We know his dates. There's some lack of clarity about the ending of his governorship and the beginning of Festus' governorship. But we read those names in Acts, and both of those governors can be identified with these extra biblical sources. So there are hints within the scripture, but they can be, as it were, corroborated by other documents outside the Bible. Then we get Herod Agrippa II, and you can see his date there. He governs for a long period of time. His father was very cruel, kind of like a mafioso type ruler. Agrippa II was more measured in his governing, and his rule lasted a long time. Now, we're not talking about the whole nation of Israel. If you can remember, the Israel that we know now was broken up into provinces with different names. So Judea, Galilee were kind of ruled separately at times, at other times they're together. So it gets complicated that way. But we have in the New Testament these historical references that can be checked outside the New Testament. And we begin to get a sense that the author of Luke and Acts is writing about real live history, right? These are things that actually happened, and he's weaving the story of Jesus and the early church into what we can identify as history. Okay, so to get to the summary, just to try to wrap it up here. Oh gosh, yes, we need to wrap it up. We do have oral and written traditions that kind of interweave through this long period of time. We have plenty of oral tradition. We have ways of capturing oral tradition, but we also now, I think scholars are beginning to feel like from earlier in the trajectory of time, there are probably more written sources closer to the events themselves because people had writing, the Jews had writing. And for a long time, the scholars didn't think the Jews had writing until later. Well, now that's with these archaeological discoveries, that time frame has been pushed backwards. We know that there are copies and copies that can be identified as families. There's a kind of genealogy of these different texts that the textual scholars can identify, and then they can draw conclusions about composition and editing and all that. We have these internal to the scriptures references that can be cross-referenced with other sources. That's what I thought I should fill in a little bit with some of those New Testament references. We have external sources, so external to the scriptures, like Josephus and many, many other documents and archaeological evidence, which is the next point. We have material artifacts that refer to people and events that not every time, but many times line up with how the scriptures refer to those people and events. I'm going to throw a complicating one in here right at the last. The James ossuary. It's a bone box. So when someone dies, the body is buried quickly. As the body dries out, as it desiccates, and the flesh and the organs and everything, eventually decay and turn into dust, what is left is the bones. Then caretakers, family members would go in and collect the bones and put the bones in a box, an ossuary, a stone box for keeping. And about 20 years ago now, the James ossuary came to light. You may have remembered reading about this. This bone box has an inscription on the side of it that says, James, in English, of course, this would be in Aramaic, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus.
Whoa.
And the box itself was dated to the 1st century. So fitting within the time frame of Jesus. And so there was tremendous excitement about this. I actually was at a meeting in Toronto about that period of time, and the James box was in Toronto, and we went to see it. Okay. Now, since then, shortly after that, and there's a lot of back and forth. Some scholars say that inscription is a forgery done much later. Other scholars say, no. Part of the inscription, and perhaps all of the inscription, actually is from the 1st century at the same time the box has been dated. Now, I have no opinion about this, right? I have no opinion about this. This is really complicated scientific stuff, getting into chemistry and all kinds of other things. But here is a material artifact. The box itself, nobody questions. It does come from the 1st century. Scholars disagree with one another about whether the inscription is contemporary with the age of the box or added later. So just very interesting stuff. And it's the ongoing how people piece things together, and these ideas come into favor and they fall out of favor. They get strengthened, they get weakened. So we hold everything carefully. Finally, back to the dates that I shared earlier. We do know that the Old Testament is formed and shaped up during those dates. So it takes a while. And then the New Testament during those dates, not so long. All right, any other questions? I've kept you way too long, but we got through the lesson.
Great.
Yeah.